So now that you've completed exercise 6.1, I want you to think a little bit about your responses. They required you to think about the different practices that we engage in, both verbally and non-verbally, when we interact with one another, and how we can look at those interactions in a little bit more structural of a way. And I have found one model particularly useful in understanding how these structural dynamics come into our communication practices. And this framework comes from Leticia Nieto and Margot Boyer, the people who brought you the addressing model. And in the same book, they also introduce us to the onion model as a way to understand the links between privilege, status, and our social interactions. And the basic idea of the onion model is that our interactions in the context of power and privilege have three layers: status, rank, and power. The outermost layer, status, is what's most easily observable. The innermost layer, power, is one that cannot be readily observed. Nieto and Boyer use this model to make sense of complex interactions. That is, say you witnessed an argument between two people. This model can help you interpret what you observed in that argument, specifically how you can interpret like the specific verbal and nonverbal communication practices that you witnessed. And I'm going to start with the innermost layer first, power. Now, Nieto and Boyer are thinking of power a bit differently here. They don't mean power in the sense of unequal advantages and privileges. They recognize that, but in this specific model, power means inner power. It refers to that thing within us that feels larger than ourselves when we become more aware of the world around us. For some people, this might be their faith. For others, it is a person who inspires them. But power in this context means that when we are able to connect with and fully be our true selves, we become aware of our rank and status and are able to challenge oppression. And what I just described is something more or less spiritual. The other facet of power is psychological power. And psychologically powerful people put their suffering to work. They make the most of it when bad things happen to them, and pain becomes a teacher. It is something that makes us more resilient. Psychologically powerful people can see many sides to a story, can feel compassion for people who anger or annoy us, and allows us to say yes to challenges despite risk and suffering. So psychologically powerful people can feel a sense of wholeness and coherence, even when times are bad. And access to that power, that sense of who you are as a person, is a really important skill when navigating barriers to intercultural praxis. It affects how we treat other people, and so it can be influenced by things like our positioning. And this is where rank comes into play. And ranking is essentially stratification. It is the ways in which we classify people hierarchically and assign differential value to agent and target group members. And the social relationships of the addressing model take place here. It is the ways in which the various social categories that shape our social location come into play. And again, this can be harder to observe in complex interactions, but ranking is essentially how we are differently positioned in relation to one another. Someone who has access to their inner power is able to be more aware of rank and can more actively try to challenge it. Others, however, might try to reinforce their rank. And this is where the outermost layer comes into play: status. And status refers to our interactional styles. It is the outermost layer because it is the layer that is easiest to observe. Again, imagine an argument between two people. You might see a lot of different behaviors out of both of them. For example, you might hear shouting. You might see certain facial expressions, such as eyes opened wide or furrowed brows to indicate anger. They might be more animated with their bodies, waving their hands in the air, for example, or they might try to show dominance by towering over the other person or by pointing their finger in their face. This is all status behavior. It is the things we say and do and how they connect to our positioning in a ranking system. So status can take two forms. The first is high status behavior. So these are the things we say and do to elevate position. These are the things we do verbally and non-verbally to make ourselves more visible, more elevated, and at times more dominant. Low status behavior, on the other hand, are the things we do to de-emphasize our position. These are the things we do verbally and non-verbally to decrease our visibility, to be less elevated, and at times to be submissive. These interactional styles can be used for the purpose of dominance, but one thing to know about these two different styles of interaction is that one isn't necessarily better or worse than the other. So for example, you might be at a party where everyone is very animated in their body language, laughing loud and telling jokes. These are all high status behaviors, but things we associate with fun. You likely don't feel you are in an unsafe place when you are in an atmosphere like this. And sometimes low status behavior is just a sign of respect. So for example, if you go to a talk on campus with a guest speaker, most people are probably going to remain silent and listen to the speaker. The silence is a low status behavior, but it's not necessarily submission. But since this lecture is focusing on context and power, I want to look at conflict for a moment. High status behavior in a conflict might look like expressions of dominance. Low status behavior would be more submissive. So for example, someone who constantly apologizes for everything, even when they didn't do anything wrong, would be exhibiting low status behavior. You might see this in body language as well, such as looking down, hunching their shoulders, and other behaviors to render themselves quote-unquote invisible. And while both agent and target group members can exhibit both interactional styles, this does not change rank. And that's a common issue in how status play becomes interpreted. There's little attention paid to rank. Anyone can exhibit high and low status behavior, and most of us engage in both throughout our daily lives. So what this means is that both agent and target group members can exhibit high status behaviors in a conflict. What does not change, however, is rank. If a person of color, for example, exhibits high status behavior towards a white person, structural racism doesn't suddenly end in that moment. It is still very much there and is likely playing a role in the conflict. In other words, when agent group members exhibit high status behaviors, particularly those to express dominance, towards a target group member, they are what is often called punching down. The photo on the left is an example of this. They are sustaining and reinforcing the ranking systems that award them certain privileges. Agent group members who do this might be fully aware of their actions and how they reinforce power, but it is also common to not be aware of those things at all. And when a target group member exhibits high status behavior towards an agent group member, they are doing what's called punching up. That is, they are challenging ranking systems. A protest, such as the photo on the right, would be an example of high status behavior. And so status play, whether high or low, can never be separated from rank. It plays a profound role in our interactional styles, and a willingness to challenge rank is really the only way to challenge oppressive behaviors. And the onion model is a tool to help us think about the links between our own status play and dialogue as a port of entry into intercultural praxis. And so questions that you might think about when you're involved in group settings, such as working on a final project in one of your classes, might be the following. How am I positioned in relation to everyone else? So work through the addressing model and place yourself and your peers within it. If you have agent group membership in all categories, think about how that might affect your interactional style. And the same for if you hold target group membership in any one or all of the categories in the addressing model. How is that coming into play in your interactions? How much space do I take up in group settings? This is where you think about how much high status or low status behavior you engage in. For high status folks, you might ask yourself, what are specific things I can do to share the space with others? And for those of you who think you maybe engage in more low status behavior, what are some of the things you can do to participate more? What do you bring to that setting that deserves visibility? I want you to keep these dynamics in mind for week 7, where we will examine intercultural conflict. Sorrells will introduce you to a multidimensional framework for understanding intercultural conflict. Any conflict can be understood on micro, meso, and macro levels. The difference between this framework and the onion model is that while the onion model is a tool to help you understand your own communication practices, like the things you do verbally and non-verbally, Sorrells' framework will help you to provide kind of a structural analysis to conflict itself. So this concludes the lecture. Please complete exercise 6.2, and as always, let me know if you have any questions about the content. Thank you.